Nathaniel Gavronsky here in the great city of Omaha, Nebraska. Now, the name Nebraska comes from the Platte River that runs through the state of Nebraska. Now, the French named it the Broad River, obviously, but the local Indians here had another name for it, and translated it was loosely flat water. Now, this indigenous word, when you anglicize it, it becomes Nebraska. So that's how the state basically gets the name Nebraska. Now, the city of Omaha gets its name from Omahan, which is the Indian tribe that was here. Now, that loosely translates into dwellers on the bluff, which is built along the cliffs above the Missouri River. Now, this territory of Nebraska was able to become and to exist because of two things. One was the Omaha Indians agreed to sell their land and they moved north to Thurston County. And then the second was the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. Now, the Kansas-Nebraska Act was authored by U.S. Senator from Illinois, Stephen Douglas. Now, that name should be familiar to most of you because Stephen Douglas is the person who debated Lincoln in those famous debates that propelled Lincoln into a national political figure. He also was the primary challenger on the Democratic side to Lincoln's Republican ticket for the 1860 presidential election, which we all know that Lincoln won leading into the U.S. Civil War. Douglas County, where Omaha is the county seat, is also named after U.S. Senator Stephen Douglas from Illinois. Now, Omaha in this area was all kind of being settled. Now, the thing was they wanted to try to negate an old compromise, the Missouri Compromise, which prevented any slave states from being able to be formed, created north of the southern border of Missouri. So what they had decided is that they're going to ordain that the state of Nebraska would be a free state, but that Kansas could be under what they would call popular sovereignty. Now, this was the culmination of what the Kansas-Nebraska Act was all about, was that states would self-determine what they were going to be. This would also help keep the balance in the Senate if you were able to have more slave states, along with the new free states that were going to be able to form in the northwest part of the continental United States. The act came into effect on May 30th of 1854. It was signed into law by President Franklin Pierce. Now, again, all this was basically to remove the Missouri Compromise, to negate that, to change how states could determine their free and slave status by popular vote. So Nebraska was preordained to be free, but Kansas was left open. And this is where you had a bunch of people from the state of Iowa and Missouri move into what was going to become Kansas and try to sway the vote, either slave or free. And this confrontation became known as Bleeding Kansas. Now, I'll do a video on Kansas later on, but this act, what allowed Nebraska to become a thing, has a larger story to it. Now, as people were moving into the frontier, moving into Nebraska, one of the ways that a lot of people basically settled the land was by homesteading. Homesteading is actually still done today. What you would do is, like, possession is 9/10 of the law, okay? So you go into a territory that's been opened up for people to settle, and you take an area and you just say, this is me, this is my house, I live here now. And you start making that your homestead. The other way a lot of people started to come into land and settle it was by forming what they call claim clubs. Now, these were the more wealthier people. These were the big landowners. And how they would do it is they would create de facto governments in an area. And these claim clubs would determine who could not buy land, who could not trade land, and what deeds and land property rights they were even going to acknowledge existed. Now, in Omaha, Nebraska, that came to a head when in the northern part of the city, in a place that was called Orchard Hill, there was a man by the name of Alexander Baker. Now, he was forced under threat of death, along with many other settlers, other homesteaders in the area, to cede their land to the claim club here in Omaha, Nebraska. Baker decided that he didn't really want to do that. He didn't like the fact that he was made to give up his lands, so he sued. And in 1857, the Supreme Court sided with Baker, ordering all the land to be given back to the homesteaders. This is very important in American history because, one, is it eliminates the land barons, the claim clubs, it makes them illegal across the country. So homesteading becomes the dominating way of settling new territory. All of the West was basically settled through homesteading based on this premise. The creation of Oklahoma through the land rush. All of this comes from this court case. The history of the United States would have been greatly altered if this case would have went the other direction. Also, homesteading, if you live in a place, if like even hotels, if you're there for long enough, or landlords, the whole process of removing someone from a residence originates from this case, along with some contract law. Okay, because he was made to sell his land under duress, that became illegal in all contracts. So you can't, by base of collusion or coercion, to make someone against their will participate in a contract. So all those contracts are null and void if it was done under duress. The legalese term for this is basically contractual holdups. So this was a pretty big case, and it came out of 1857 out of Omaha, Nebraska, and that's had a huge impact on all of American history. Now, Omaha, as it started to grow, became the de facto eastern hub of the Transcontinental Railroad. Now, Abraham Lincoln actually wanted the hub to be in Council Bluffs, Iowa, but because of the building of the bridges across the river, it took him a little while before that was able to be done. So it actually became Omaha, Nebraska, where people would start to get all their supplies and move out west. Now, the Mormons had been moving through this area for quite some time, so this was a popular crossing spot. So people knew that people were going to need supplies here, and so Omaha basically grew on supplying people that were leaving the state. Omaha was also the territorial capital of Nebraska originally, and it kept the territorial capital until 1867, when the capital moved to Lincoln, Nebraska. And I did a video. If you watch my video on the Nebraska State Capitol, you'll get to see a little bit more about that. So the city was able to survive the panic of 1857 because of the capital being here. It was able to grow because people were moving westward and needing supplies. And as the railroads increased and travel increased, the city was able to grow quite substantially. Also, after the Civil War, a lot of people were moving westward. This, and as I talked in many other videos, that a lot of the native peoples that were here, they kept getting moved further and further west. So the ones from Illinois had been moved this far over, and then into Nebraska. And the ones that were already in Nebraska were being moved further west, and then now further southwest. And a lot of some of these Indians were, well, I didn't understand what was going on. The language, the translation wasn't very good, and so a lot of Indians who were giving up their lands, being told to go to the Indian Territory, which is now Oklahoma, they were under the understanding they would get to stay in Nebraska. And when they were forcefully removed, by the time they got to the reservations in Oklahoma, they weren't able to plant any food, any crops. And so many of them starved to death. One Indian chief in particular, Chief Standing Bear, his son, as he was dying, really wanted to be buried in his ancestral homeland, which is around Omaha, Nebraska. So once he passed on, his father, Chief Standing Bear, brought him back to this area to be buried in peace. But because he left his reservation, he was arrested. The army officer that arrested him went by the name of Cook. Now, Cook really wasn't a big fan of this whole process and really didn't like what was going on. So he befriended Chief Standing Bear, and he talked Chief Standing Bear into filing suit against his violation of habeas corpus, which is basically you can't be held for so long without you having rights, without due process, speedy trial. All of that stuff is basically habeas corpus. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but essentially that's what habeas corpus is all about. Now, Cook becomes the formal defendant in this case because he's the army officer in charge of detaining and holding Chief Standing Bear. So this court case is taking place in 1879. By this time, it's been 15 years since the U.S. Civil War has ended. 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment have been passed. Just to give you some perspective on the time frame here. In his defense, Chief Standing Bear offered up testimony, and his testimony was actually quite moving. When I was reading it, I must admit, it was pretty hard to read. But he basically held up his finger And I said, if I prick my finger, do I not bleed like you? Do I not feel pain like you? Am I not the same as you? God made me. I am a man. This was his testimony to the court about why he should have the same rights and not have his habeas corpus rights violated by the United States government. And when the judge came down in favor of Chief Standing Bear, that's the very first time in 1879 that the U.S. government recognized that Native peoples were in fact people and humans with all the rights available to them under the United States Constitution and the U.S. Declaration of Independence. This is quite late, actually, in U.S. history when this is done. And it was kind of moving because, I'm doing these videos across Iowa and across Nebraska and around the country. And I talk about how Indians were being moved, but how a lot of times there were Army officers, U.S. officers, and members of the government that befriended them. It wasn't all just the U.S. came in and kicked them all out. It's more complicated than that. And I talked about in Iowa with General Joseph Street and Chief Wapello. Here in Nebraska with Chief Standing Bear and the Army Officer Cook, they that friendship, you can see pivotal moments when, yes, our history is not perfect, no country is, but you can see when the United States is striving to be a better country. You can see those moments when it's just a small little moment, it's just a single court decision, a single transaction, a friendship, a shaking of the hands that changes things, where you can see the United States becoming a better United States. And as I continue doing these videos, I hope to keep showcasing these moments in times where you can see the United States actually improving. We have a long ways to go. No country is perfect, but we have done so many great things in our 243 years of existence. And I want to keep showcasing those good things because we should be very, very proud of our accomplishments. But at the same time, I want to make sure that we learn from our mistakes, that we become better. We keep becoming a better society. And that's the very thing I want to end on, because I am in Omaha, I am in Nebraska. And if you watch my video about the Nebraska Capitol, on top of their Capitol is a statue, and they call that statue the sower. Now, what he did, what he represents, obviously agriculture, because he's tilling the land, he's tilling the soil. But it's more than that. It's really a lot more than that. And I really wish every other state would really look at the meaningful aspects of what the sower represents. Is that you work hard, you do all these things, because you want to make a better society. And you make that better society by working at it, by doing things sometimes the hard way. And that represents the good aspects of this country. Some of the things that I wish people really understood, that this country has done so many great things in its short time on this in existence compared to other cultures. But our experiment in self-government, our experience in democracy, which has transcended everything the Greeks, the Romans, any other society in the world has ever done, that we are still improving. We'll still be able to become better. And as we see those moments in our history, we can learn from them so we can act upon them in the future and in the present. And that's important to know. That's why we should learn our history, and that's why I'm doing these videos. I want to thank you for your time, and I wish everyone a wonderful evening.